welcome to the Northern Virginia Technology Council Cybersecurity and Privacy Community of Interest. It's our great pleasure to have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Ryan Wright. Dr. Wright is the C. Coleman McGehee Professor of Commerce and also the Associate Dean of the Faculty Research at the University of Virginia's McIntire School of Commerce. Before I turn it over to Dr. Wright, I want to thank Loudoun County Economic Development and Chris Freiberg, who's on this call with us, as they are sponsors of this event. Just to give you a little bit of a background on Dr. Wright, he's an expert in what's called human elements of cybersecurity, as well as digital product management. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Commonwealths of Massachusetts, as well as Virginia, and other funding hosts. He has more than 60 publications and journals, in effect, in many cases, and books, chapters, etc. Somehow I noticed that he's been to a Hawaii International Conference on System Sciences, I think about 11 times. So I needed him to explain how to do that. But he is really a prolific writer and a very well-known individual and professor in this area of cybersecurity and the human elements. He's going to talk to us today about how to leverage that human firewall. Currently, he is a co-chair of the International Conference on Information Systems in 2021, and he serves on many editorial boards and is currently associate editor of MIS Quarterly. So, Dr. Wright, excuse me, I'd like to call you Ryan, if we may. I want to turn it over to you and let you engage with the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe, for that introduction. And please, Ryan is fantastic if we stick with that nomenclature for our talk. I want to also thank Chris Freiberg and Loudoun County for sponsoring this as well. Chris, it's good to see you. I also see some friendly faces, Javier in the audience and others. What I'm really going to encourage this to be is a conversation. My hope is I can kind of outline what we've been doing for the last 16 years regarding kind of the human elements of cybersecurity. And then we can have conversations about some of the future research projects we have, any questions you might have as well. So feel free to drop those in the chat, drop those in the Q&A. I am really used to teaching online, unfortunately, nowadays. So doing this multimodal is very much a part of my life. And I'll give you a short story. So my 8-year-old was asked by his teacher last spring what his dad did. And he said, my dad goes down to the basement and yells at his computer all day long, which was, I went down and taught as well. So that's a little bit about my life, but I'm happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk about kind of the work we're doing at UVA and at the McIntire School as well. I'm going to share my slides so you can see those, and there's a few things that I'll want to kind of go through. So give me a half second. You'll unfortunately see yourselves for a second, and then I'll go ahead and select my slide so we can see that as well. So I'll be toggling on and off. I just want to give you an overview. I'm going to talk about one really interesting research project because there's several with all of this, but I want to give you some insights too into kind of my background. So I started in as a engineer, systems engineer. So I was running networks, I was running cables, I was upgrading router tables, all those different things in my former life. Started a technology company and sold it, and then figured out what should be my second career. So I went in and I studied cognitive psychology at a business school in Washington for several years. And I had an opportunity to marry these two interests I have with systems engineering and with cognitive psychology in a research project we did with Microsoft, which kind of kicked off this whole episode of the Human Firewall. So this was back in 2005 when we thought we had significant security problems and we just didn't know what was down the road for us in the next 16, 17 years. And the idea is they fired up this tool that they called the Anti phishing bar tool. And I'm curious if anybody's seen that or heard that before. One of the things is we all loved our toolbars at that moment. And one of the things that they found out, it was like, nobody is using our toolbar. We actually provide warnings. Do not go to these websites, but people are still going to these websites. And that fascinated me. So we started to investigate why people are motivated to do insecure things and how to get the right motivation to do secure things in organizations and businesses. So this is kind of where it starts with. And I want to start you kind of with these security threats, right? So this is last year's security threats. I just looked at a document from KPMG that mirrored this as well, that looked at what CIOs thinks the top threats are. Of course, 0 days is a big thing for them. These unpatched systems that can happen. DDoS is a constant threat for them to bring down their services, but it still is ransomware and phishing. And the reason I say 2020, this was the case, and in fact, when I initially started the funded project of this, it was the exact same list, unfortunately, 7 years ago. The difference being that ransomware and phishing have now merged into this thing now, right? Which it's the most common threat. And when you think about it, this is all the attacks on the humans. This is why I'm interested in it. So Verizon Data Breach Report, which is kind of a famous report for security researchers, we all point to it. In fact, an alumnus of our program, Chris Porter, who's a Chief Information Security Officer over at Fannie Mae, was one of the founders of this Verizon Data Breach Report. And others just say, hey, listen, the easiest way for people to get into your organization right now and to even infect your system through ransomware right now is still phishing. It's still phishing, right? Even though we've been working on this problem for the last 16 years. And this is one of my favorite quotes. And then we'll get into the goodness that is the research itself. Is amateurs hack systems, professionals hack people. And that's a fellow researcher. One of his books I would highly recommend is his 2018 book with a tightly macabre title, Click Here to Kill Everyone. He talks about how the biggest attacks unfolded, and it was a series of errors that kind of went through this particular thing. And unfortunately, we've had a series of errors here, even at UVA. So this was a 2016 attack. We have a famous attack from 2018 as well, where we actually had to unplug the university from the internet. I want to say that again, because we have a hospital, and you can imagine what that means. We had to unplug the university for network to get out these bad actors. You can read more about that. We wrote a case about it in the Harvard Business Review about the remediation of that attack, what it took to get these folks out, how we had to scrub all sorts of systems. Just send me an email and I'm happy to share that. You do not have to pay the $895 in order to do that for this particular group. So that just kind of sets the stage for some things that I, are interested in looking at and why we find this problem really interesting. And I want to stop here, and I'm going to look at your chat and your messages, etc. And I'd love to hear from this group as well, is what are the things that your organization's the most pressing needs cybersecurity-wise for your organizations? So I'd love to hear from this group. If you want to drop them in the messages, that would be fantastic. The chat, the Q&A, anything like that as well. I see Chris read Bruce's book. It is a great book too. So what are the things in your organization, cybersecurity-wise, that is the most pressing issue, top of mind for the folks that are visiting with us? So I'll wait a moment. If you want to drop that in the chat, that would be really helpful. And I'm one of those professors that's going to wait for the answer too, by the way. So anything pressing, I'll take anything kind of to start us off this All right. While I'm waiting for that, we have some nervous students, I suppose. I do want to introduce the Human Firewall project, and I want to talk a little bit about this. So let me get back to sharing my screen so you can actually see that as well. So the Human Firewall project itself started out as a National Science Foundation project with some boutique consultants, some consultants that you know of, my colleagues at University of Oklahoma, VMware, etc. And we were trying to meld the technology systems and the behavioral systems. And we call this the social technical solutions. So how could firewalls inform human behavior, and how can human behavior inform firewalls, for example? And that's where the Human Firewall came into action, where we could build models, where we could do things like based on the way your organization handles things like emails, we can tell you who's the most susceptible and who's the least susceptible. That was kind of what we were looking at for this project. There is a disclaimer I have to do with any funded research, or these are the views and conclusions of me, Ryan, and my team. And they are not implied or expressed by NSF or the US government. So I have to say that before I show you the stuff that they helped us kind of build out as well. So you may have seen some things in Harvard Business Review. I'm happy to share those. I'll drop those links in Forbes, Washington Post, etc. about this concept of the Human Firewall project. But I'll tell you, it's a series of works. It's several papers, several grants that have kind of culminated in our current thinking of what's interesting and what's not. The one Harvard Business Review, again, I'll drop this in the links at the end of the talk. They highlighted this research is they basically Harvard interpreted our years of research down to 5 bullet points, which is always a fascinating exercise, right? And they really said a couple things, and that's really what this talk is about. And it really is, believe it or not, going back to my project back at Microsoft, where I said, hey, what's going on? We have this toolbar and we give these warnings and nobody listens to the warning. So one of the first things we did with these warnings is we did some really interesting studies where we just examined how people view warnings, right? We would pop up warnings in a lab. We have colleagues of mine that I've worked with at University of Arizona and Brigham Young University that stuck people in to fMRI machines to see what their brain activity was doing with these warnings. And believe it or not, this is something that probably surprises nobody on this call, is we don't adhere or read warnings. So when you think about the last warning message that popped up on your computer, you could probably say, how do I get this off my screen as quickly as I possibly can? And the problem with that thinking then is we've overwhelmed our what we call cognitive overload, our senses with warnings. So we have warnings all sorts within our systems. And the problem when you overload the warnings, then you don't know what are important and you don't know what are not. And you're just trying to do your job, right? People are inherently just trying to do their job and make themselves kind of happy, right? So, Tom, you asked a really good question about obsolete. I'll put a pin in that because I think there's some interesting things around this as well. And it's funny, Danny, you mentioned that text scamming. The thing with the text scamming as well is that they the text scamming as well is I in fact just got one last night from my boss, the dean, that tried to give out my information as we go through this. So we'll talk about these things. We'll talk about kind of the best practices as we move forward, but I think it's really important to kind of frame this. So I want to start with kind of a famous book in our particular area that we used to, and it's from a Nobel scientist, Daniel Kahneman. And it's probably something, I don't know if you've read this book. If you have, you know, drop it in the chat. I'd be interested in that. is this idea of thinking fast and thinking slow. And let me show you what this is for those, and I'll save you $17.99 so you don't really have to read the book. So this is the Cliff Notes of this. So basically what happens is whenever we're given a message or persuasive message, our brain has two routes that it can take to help solve our message, a peripheral route and a central route. So the peripheral route, this one below here, is less cognitive takes place. This is a heuristic. This is like on Saturday, what I did with my kid is I hopped in the car, we're going to basketball practice. I jumped in and I started driving to work. That is a heuristic that I do every day, but on Saturday, I don't typically do that. That's peripheral route. Peripheral route really helps us as humans because it allows us not to have to think really heavily to do every single task. You know, when you grab your phone in the morning, it's just kind of automatic, the things you go to. You're not thinking, I wonder what website or what thing I'm going to go to. We have all these heuristics built in. The central route is issue relevant thinking and engaged thinking. This is when you sit down and you make a decision. What we say here with the central route is a pause. If you pause for the briefest of moments, these are the things, these issue relevant thinking that we have kind of taking place. So this is what's going on in your brain, right? When you're making any kind of phishing messages, security decisions, you use these two routes. Well, our research states, well, what if you can use a peripheral route, and in fact, you use a peripheral route all the time when you're answering emails, you're just pounding out work, but what if we're able to nudge you at the right time and the right place? So we spent, it started in 2015, we spent the last 6 years kind of thinking about this. Let me give an example of how this works in security. So I picked on a colleague of mine, University of Houston, at the time, and I looked at, hey, tell me what your current training is for phishing, as an example, or security, or whatever it is. So I'm able to share this because it's a public university, and this is what they gave you. They gave their users. It's like bad address, bad graphics, bad capitalization. Here's all the things you have to look out for, etc. We know from alerts that we're not going to pay attention to this. We can't look at every message as like, is that bad graphics? Is that bad capitalization? We can't pause and do that for all our messages. So we have this mismatch between what we're asking the users to be secure and actually how their brain works, right? So we looked at this and we came up with this idea that this rules-based training, here's all the rules that you have to apply to all the email messages that you actually do, or here's all the rules you have to apply to all the data security methods you have to do. They're not as effective, right? And so we ran an experiment to test this, and we called one rules-based training and the other one we called mindfulness training. And mindfulness training isn't the Eastern conceptualization. It's just saying, hey, does this seem wrong? Is this weird, right? What is the goal of this particular message? Rather than giving them a list of rules, if they just had one or two cues, right? So one of the great things about this, you've probably seen, or you may have seen similar kind of mindfulness training efforts now out. And one of them was the Commerce Department, who now rolls out this Stop, Think, Act. That's mindfulness training, right? That is way more effective on reducing phishing clicks than rules-based training. I'll say rules-based training does decrease clicks. I'm not going to claim it doesn't. But the mindfulness training, making it simple, maps with, those persons, the way those people act and what they're actually looking at, right? So how do we get protected, from this harm? What are the things we can do to do this? So one of the things, and I've said this in the Harvard Business Review article that, again, I'll drop in chat in a moment here. One of the things that's absolutely clear to us, that people try to make their training too complex. They try to make their security too complex. And that has that degrades the security rather than increases the security. We call the people who are doing it right, and we're doing a study right now with Fortune 50 companies. we think the best people in security are the bridge builders. They're trying to figure out what users are trying to do, help them solve those problems. So that, you know, me sitting in a business school, I'm really interested in that because I want to understand how business leaders can solve cybersecurity rather than engineering, which has a very different perspective. They're trying to solve cybersecurity with zeros and ones. We're trying to solve it with processes and people, right? What we think are extremely important for those types of things. So let me show you just real quickly a study about how business schools can actually get this accomplished and why this is so significant. And so let me share my screen one more time. Thank you. And this is the problem. So since 2007, when we started tracking these statistics, we've seen here that about 19% of companies clicked on the email and about 3% gave up their information. We see study and study and study that says we are about the exact same. And in fact, a 2020 study we did in an organization was about 28%. So we might even be getting worse at phishing susceptibility because the attacks are getting better and better and better. So what they do is they go out to your LinkedIn and then they go out to your Facebook if it's public, or they go out to your Instagram. They tease off particular things about you, and then they try and use that information so you will then click on a link or give up that important information, etc. What people don't understand, especially with these phishing and security exercises, we're like, oh, they send out, you know, 100,000 of these. Well, that's not the case anymore. In fact, the Verizon breach report that's out, that's fascinating, that goes through 1,300 different breaches that happened at companies, says the average number of phishing emails sent out when in a campaign is 13. They pick out 13 people in your company and said, these are the people we think that are really interested or that are really interesting for us that we can attack. And there's, you know, story after story after story. So what are the variables? What are these factors then that we're missing? Because we studied all these things. I've looked at the properties of the email. I've looked at the demographics of the person. I've looked at stuff like what was their GPA in undergrad? And we looked at all these different factors, trying to figure out, is there a profile? And what we found, there really isn't a profile. There really isn't a person that is less or more susceptible that has like a certain trait. There are states you can be more or less susceptible by where you are. We know that you make better decisions while you're sitting at your work computer working than walking down the street on your phone, right? Again, that goes back to that peripheral thinking versus central thinking. When you're sitting down and you're active and you're working on something and you're not tired. There was a study out by colleagues of mine at Temple that looked at how tired people were as one of these factors for sleeping. So we know those are important, but we think we found kind of the significant factor. And it all comes from this guy, James Clark at Harvard. So this is 1960s. And what he said in the 1960s, and something that we all know on this call, is that performance is indicated by your work group, has a direct correlation between who you work with. So it's in fact teams is the right level of analysis for your individual performance. This started the 360 trends. This started trying to make the best teams rather than the best individuals. Well, we've forgotten about all this research in 1960. We've forgotten that we work together. Typically, we all work together on teams now. And we're just saying cybersecurity is an individual problem. Well, we wanted to study this and see if that was the particular case. And we wanted to see if these work group factors, who your work group are, and your social networks, who you're connected with, really affected security as well. So we dove into this. And in 2016, we negotiated with our CFO and our institutional review board, a whole bunch of people saying we want a financial unit, 180 employees. We want to collect all their email metadata and see who they're emailing. So metadata isn't the content of the message, but of course it's just kind of who you're doing the to and from thing. We asked all these people who they worked with most frequently. We looked at the org chart for this as well. We asked who their friends were at work. We asked where they went to get IT support. And then you know what we did? We phished them. And we saw, can we build a model that predicts phishing susceptibility based on these social aspects, which hasn't been studied really before. So I know you're dying to figure out kind of what this is. So let me lead to the punchline, and then I'll talk about a couple of things, and then we'll start asking some questions about your organizations. So what we found here is your coworkers' relationships and your IT advice relationships are really different. So you emailed approximately in a week 309 times daily between your team, but you asked very rarely for IT advice. In fact, you only did it a couple times a year. So this is a security question. This is how do I fix the printer question. These are things that come up. So we see this kind of interesting pattern as well. We also noticed that your friendships are basically your teammates as well, at least high-functioning teams. We have some people out here that are not friends on the team, and we've all experienced that as well. But typically, your friendships are on that team. And this is what it looks like. So here's your working relationship here. And this is also who you email. As you can imagine, you email people on the team. It's pretty linear is what this is showing. But IT advice is all over the place. Some teams talk to each other. Some teams don't. This is interesting in itself because we know that, oh, that's it. We thought, oh, you just ask your teammates for advice. That is not what is happening in most organizations. So they're going outside that. So we built something called a social network diagram. And it's not social network like Facebook, but it's basically where you go to for advice. So we built one for coworkers here. So this is who you are actually connected to the most. And the color codings are your teams. So we see the red and the kind of off red colors are all on the same team. We see the yellows over here, and they're kind of talking to each other. We see this group is really tight and talking to each other. IT advice is kind of all over the place, right? We have these two folks out here that only talk to each other for IT advice, right? We have this person that's not talking to his team at all, but relying on these folks. So does this make you more or less secure in your organization when your IT advice is kind of spread out, which includes security questions? So this is what we found. And I'm going to pause here and answer some questions too. And what this chart shows you is this is less susceptible factors and more susceptible factors. Anything that's a 1 statistically means it's not more or less. It's right down the line. It doesn't give you more susceptibility to phishing attacks. It doesn't give you less susceptibility to phishing attacks, right? So we see here in a work group, their resilience, how resilient they felt their team was. We asked them that question. It's touching the line, so that means it's not significant. Doesn't matter for this particular model. But self-efficacy does. And self-efficacy is this idea, in this case, the idea that you know what you're doing as far as technology. If you feel confident in your ability to make decisions, and that's important because I'll talk to you about the role of the IT help desk and security in a second. If you feel confident, you're less susceptible. If your team feels confident, is even more. Not if you personally are, but if your team. Time pressure is not surprising. That goes right to that central and peripheral route. If your team is under a tremendous amount of time pressure, they're going to be more susceptible to phishing attacks. This task centrality, what that means is if your team is closer together, if they do their tasks and they're tightly knit together, whether or not that means they're less susceptible. So that means if you're a better teammate, you're more secure as well. Real interesting finding. And this is the one that I want to underline, and I'll pause on here for a moment. Relies on the help desk. This was opposite of what we thought it would be. And basically what this says, that if you go to the IT help desk more, you're more susceptible to phishing attacks. In other words, if you're connecting with these people and they're saying, hey, when you have a question, come to us, and you're more susceptible to phishing attacks. The people who don't go to the IT help desk are less susceptible. So your frontline folks for security tend to be the worst case for your organizations. And the reason, there's several different reasons, and I'll get to the kind of big aha moment here, but there's several different reasons on why we think that is absolutely the case. So let me pause here. That was a real quick dump of like 15 years of stuff. I want to talk about what this means and how you can build security, what this finding in particular means. But I want to pause here and see if we have any questions, comments, or concerns from folks. Hey, Chris, that great question about the COVID. So what has happened in organizations, and we're studying this right now, so I don't have I have a hypothesis, Chris, but I don't have an answer. So come back in a few months and we'll have an answer for this. What we're seeing right now is distributed security. So no longer does that kind of hardened outside security work. We've known that for a few years now, and that's why there's this thing called zero trust that everybody talks about, but very few people actually implement because it's really, really hard to do in organizations. But they're saying zero trust, nobody should trust anybody, and that is for technology trusting each other. What typically we do is we harden the outside. So we VPN in to that outside. We have obviously secure connection on that VPN, and we trust that's what's going on. But we've seen an explosion in ransomware, with food companies, small cities, large cities are being attacked. Government is constantly being attacked. We're seeing this bleed down to medium-sized and small businesses that have a distributed workforce, is because their security wasn't designed to do those things, right? So now what's happening is we have somebody who can get in at kind of the level 1 of this attack, and then they can kind of go through their whole network because they think it's Chris that's dialing in from home. Dialing is an old term, but commuting in from home in order to get this sensitive information, right? And again, so now they are phishing people at their homes, which is, we think, is a significant problem, and why we saw the ransomware go from basically 0 5 years ago to being a significant national level problem, where we're now setting policy to secure infrastructure and organizations. So Danny, good question. Iterative learning an asset for hackers. So this is the constant battle, right? So, and I'll tell you a story that one of the editors of one of our big journals, when we published this back probably 5 6 years ago, and we said, hey, here's the people in your organization that could be most susceptible, and here's the types of messages that they tend to click on, right? So we had sort of a typology of that. And the editor pushed back at us like, aren't you just creating a playbook for the hackers? And yes, that's exactly, all this research, because it's open source, does create that. So it has this kind of iterative effect. Why we think thinking about your social technical problem is different, because then these types of things, when they change the message, it doesn't matter. When they change the technology, it doesn't matter as much. So you'll see, for example, Homeland, if you haven't seen, Homeland has basically, here's what you should do for any businesses as your basic hygiene. Here's the 5 things. Like, make sure your machines are patched. For example, make sure people know what to do when they click on a phishing email, which is a huge problem. You can't, not being punitive, which I've been beating that drum for a number of times, is we don't go around to our organizations and punishing people. What you do, and this is straight from behavior and behavioral therapy, is what you do is you reward the good behaviors as much as you can and mitigate the bad, but you don't technically punish those. There's some organizations, and I'll say that for my DoD friends out there, that is quite effective using punishment to cure behavior, but not all organizations can be as harsh as that. So that's a long answer, Danny, to your very short question on kind of iterative. Let me show you just real quickly. I think it's important to kind of see what this looks like in terms of the attacks and where they are. And I'll go back to, in this case, I'll go back to my network diagram so you can see how these teams are more or less secure. So if we look at, in this case, this is your task network. So these are, let me grab my pen here. These are color-coded. And I realize looking at this now, this is not colorblind friendly. So I apologize for that as well, using shades of red and green. But we see, for example, here, this team right here, right? Tightly knit together, close. They work pretty much exclusively, right? As well. We see other teams like this pink team that's kind of more distributed, this solid green team, but let's keep our eyes on two teams here. We'll do the dark blue team and this light blue team that's kind of has an interesting shape. And then when I actually say, okay, which of these teams fell for this? Well, in this case, we see these tightly grouped teams, these two teams in here. They did have a couple red dots. This team had no red dots, and a red dot denotes that they actually clicked on a phishing email and provided their information. When we run the statistics on this, we see that this is where organizations are having problems. Is these teams that kind of don't work well together, these teams that don't really interact with each other, and these teams that are not going to each other for advice, right? The best teams are closely knit. They may be closely knit and using tools like Slack and Teams and all these other things. So they can even do a little bump saying, hey, I got this weird message. What's going on with that? It's like, yeah, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't deal with that. Those are the ways that you build security in the organizations. It's not through comprehensive rule-based training, right, that we all have to do. And when we think about this, when we look at all of our results, we know that if you want to increase susceptibility, encourage people to go to the help desk as much as they can. So we think you need to rethink the help desk. And maybe the help desk shouldn't be the folks down in the basement. You should elevate those and distribute those into teams. What else increases susceptibility is this trust in IC support. That's interesting. And I'll come back to that question too. And I think it's going to answer Tom's question as well. What everybody thought would increase or decrease susceptibility is training. Hey, the more training they do, the better. They're going to be more susceptible. That's actually not true. In several studies we have, age is not true. In several studies, IT advice network. In other words, how do you go to the IT advice? There's no difference here. So we have these people going to the help desk. We have these other people that are using their team. The people that are going to help desk are suffering, and these people that are using their team are doing better. Training frequency has nothing. So here it is. This is our main thesis. And I'll give you an example here, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I call this indemnification. Think about your credit card, right? So everybody's had their credit card number stolen at some point in time. If you haven't, you're going to. It's just going to happen. It happened to me this summer. And I do strange things like I look at gas pumps and shake them to make sure there's no skimmers on it, etc. My number was stolen. It was used. And all I did was my credit card company called me saying, hey, did you make these charges? Did you buy cameras in Florida? And I said, no. And basically they took care of it and forgot it. Your credit card company is indemnifying you for that, meaning they're making sure you use your credit card and you're doing it without having to think. So they'll pay for that, and that's part of their operating model, right? Well, in security, we may be having the same problem where we think, here's our laptop. I don't know what I clicked on. I don't know what I do. IT support, just fix it, give it back to me. Okay, we're good now. So we're indemnified from actually acting insecurely in our particular networks. And we think that's a big problem. And we think that's the core of why this is different, is because we're over supported as IT people, right? And talking about, you know, the best security practices is rethinking our support, rethinking our training, doing those things that we think are significant in order to get us to be more or less secure. So that's a punchline really of today, is we think IT support is broken. We now have said this publicly in the Harvard Business Review and other places. We think punitive for phishing simulations, which most of our companies do, is broken. And we think, how do we create an environment where it's safe for us to have these discussions as a team? So our three big takeaways here, if you wanted to do this in an organization and you wanted to change what you wanted to do, but do it quite lightweight, our first thing is, rather than train the individual, train the team. We train teams all the time. Why aren't we training teams in security? We're building up team muscles to do all sorts of things to make them more efficient. We're doing the opposite when it comes to cybersecurity, and we're forgetting about all this best practices and high team performance. Why can't we utilize that, right? The second is being fair when you test and using phishing simulations. So most companies do it. All Fortune 500 companies are now doing some sort of phishing simulation. Your company will send you a simulated phishing. They'll click on it. It'll say, hey, you fell for this attack. You know, maybe they'll say, now you have to go do this training, which is a punishment, by the way, right? So we have this training, and we're less secure because we're put through that regimen. So thinking about ways of saying, rather than punishing people, about building out the right way to think, be more mindful, teaching them the right principles to do this, and doing that through their team. And the third thing is critical, is bring your IT support out of the basement, literal or figurative, and put them in contact with your teams so they know who to go to. You can create these super users on your team that maybe can support users, those people that you go to say, how do you do this? How do you do that? Create that ability, right, in order to do that team performance. So we think those are three things that any organization can do. We've done all sorts of things with leaderboards. We tried those. I'm happy to answer any questions with leaderboards, where we have contests to see which team performs the best during Cybersecurity Month. Those are really effective and bleed over to other months to make you more secure. There's other things you can do, but we think those are kind of the three big ones. So we feel free to jump in your questions. I'm reading them now. These are great. Is there a high T or support model that you are proposing? So what? So here's the we're now studying 14 financial or Fortune 50 organizations to answer that exact question about help desk and IT support model. We can tell you from our research that we think the right model is not to identify the user. So if something goes wrong, you need to kind of turn that into an aha moment. You just don't hand their laptop back to them. But you can't do that in a punitive way, right? So that is the fine dance that IT support needs to play. And you shouldn't have things like, hey, if you spot a phishing email, send it to phishing@virginia.edu, which a lot of organizations do. You need to humanize IT support so they know who they are, they interact with IT support, and they look at them as a business partner. And this is Chris Porter's language, Fannie Mae, CISO, rather than a governing unit, right, of what that is. So what about if you fall for a real attack? Should you get punished? Should there be laws protecting employees from getting fired and victims? James, that's a really, again, great question about that. So right now, there are many organizations that if you fall for multiple attacks it will affect things like your compensation. It will affect things like your employment status at some organizations as well. So there's no laws that prevent that. It is you failed these tests. They do secure your organization. I'm not going to lie. We've seen a decrease in those types of social engineering attacks in those organizations. But we think if you want to create a better culture, why don't you empower teams like we've been talking about for the last 10 years in order for them to be high performing? And then we have that same spirit when we attack kind of the cybersecurity culture of things. So yeah, embedding IT support into the business units and functions. That is exactly correct. The most effective, we have a paper coming out about this. I won't bore you with it, but the most effective IT support teams do activities called bridging. So this is a number of things you can do in your activities. Rather than buffering, we're just going to lock everything down and nobody can do anything. Because what happens is that business units and people will have workarounds for whatever. Think of something like, hey, I can't send this from the corporate email, so I'll just use this email. Hey, I'm not allowed to do this, so I'm just going to spin up my own Dropbox account and do this. Makes you more insecure. Rather than these people actually embedded in the business units, helping them solve these problems. So they're more technology consultants and then identify the risks. So Mike Higgins, who was the chief security guy at the New York Times, he was the chief security guy at NBC Universal. He's now a part of the security team at Amazon. He goes, I will never walk into a business unit and say, you cannot do this, because they're going to figure out a way to do this. What I will tell them is what risks are involved and how they can be more secure to help them balance that. I think that's the thought leadership in the risk elements and the cybersecurity elements that is clearly missing. I'm going to give an opportunity. I know my host wanted to jump back into, and I've been talking a million miles an hour to ask me a couple questions, but I'm happy to continue going with the chat as well. Hey, Gabe. Oh, you're muted, sir. My favorite thing to say nowadays.
There we go. I came off mute. Ryan, this is excellent. Thank you so much. You've really opened up some interesting topics and ideas here. A few quick takeaways I want to underscore, which is we've made security too complex. You said that, or someone stated that, you've reiterated it. The idea of teams and embedding teams and the IT advice into the teams. It almost seems like, we went through in the 80s and the 90s, a lot of COTS software, IT solutions, but it was requiring to be successful. We learned the art of re-engineering, which is people and process piece, and the technology is that third leg. It sounds like in the cybersecurity space, we're repeating that. In other words, we've created too much dependency on a technology product per se, and the ins and outs of that product, versus looking at the social aspect of the organization, and then looking at that complexity factor about how do you simplify and how do you build. Am I maybe right on that in terms of it's a mirroring? I think you're
dead on. And I do want to understate that the technology needs to be invested to secure our systems. That is not what I'm saying.
Sure.
But if you just do that, that is not going to be enough, because you'll find this attitude that we've run into these companies is, oh, it's our users are our worst enemies. Well, that's the wrong mindset, because we know the most effective, as you say, it's people, process, and technologies, right? So building out that people part, and because we work in teams, all this stuff we've known for years that we've kind of forgotten about with cybersecurity, it seems to be really effective. And there's organizations that are doing this right now, and it's working well for them. And I'll tell you why it's working well for them. Because that endpoint solution is millions and millions of dollars if you're a big company. And I'm saying absolutely these endpoint solutions that go around and all the machine learning that we have, I can tell you, we've all sat through those presentations. It's like we have AI intelligence that detect da-da-da-da-da. but the actors are so good now that they're not doing massive scale attack. And what machine learning does not do very well is detect low end type of events, things that happen once or twice or 3 times, right? So you need to laminate the processes and the people on top of the technology. Again, we've known it for 20 years. So I kind of feel silly even having this conversation.
This is great. Open it up for more questions from the audience. We have another 5 or 7 minutes or so. And just another comment is, I love the idea of that, you mentioned the engineers, the ones and zeros, and the business looking at it from a process standpoint. And that, we used to say in the old transformation days, you couldn't, 70% of the transformations failed because you didn't deal with the people aspect, the change management aspect. Yep. Sounds like the same sort of number could be what you conclude in security, cybersecurity.
Yeah, and that's a study we're running right now, and it is clear to us that's exactly what's going on in organizations. It's easy. We've all sat through those vendor, and they have fantastic solutions. And I don't want to mitigate. And the technologies are getting better and better and better. But there isn't a correlation between investment in technology and security. There isn't that hard correlation. Yes, you need to do those things. There's some basic things you need to take care of, and there's just some solutions out there that will make you more secure. But I can tell you from our research, the investment in people, which is not as expensive, will give you a huge bang for your buck.
And one last comment while we wait, see if other people have questions. Do you have a white paper or something like that that's been that you could send? I took a note on the business case, but anything you have written in white paper fashion of this theme would be maybe interested for.
Yeah, so there's a couple things that I'll drop in. I'll drop in the HBR article, which is the quick read, which I think most people will be helpful for that article. It talks about this idea of doing these things, doing these processes, but not having to build, not being the security trumps all, because we know people will just work around those things, right? I'll give you a great example. So I was working with an organization, and what they said is, hey, we are not going to be sharing links anymore in our emails, right? So they shut that off, and they're using a Microsoft product to shut it off. So people just continue to share documents, but they use Box and Dropbox and these other things to get around that because you're impeding their job. Can you imagine going to your salespeople and saying you can't share documents anymore? It's that idea of we've gotten away from security. Is like we need to lock everything down. Zero trust is kind of the hot term, and zero trust towards people is not the right way to think about this.
Excellent. Any questions from the folks on the line? Please raise your hand and we'll make sure you get on. Chris asked a question about, do you see only businesses moving forward, only accepting digitally signed emails?
Yeah, so here's the problem with the technology infrastructure. The stuff was designed in the 50s, implemented in the 60s, and that includes the internet protocols and the email protocols, et cetera, spun up in the 70s and 80s and widely used in the 90s, and basically hasn't changed since. So digitally signed emails will get you part of the way, right? Part of the way there, but we still have, 40% of all websites that aren't encrypted. So that HTTPS that we should all be familiar with. I really think it's a hygiene thing. So just looking at, are you patching systems, Equifax, for example, right? And it's just the simple things. There is an interesting article that you can find that Cisco has these 5 things they call the 5 tenets of cybersecurity. And it is things like patching. It is things like just making sure when your users actually leave the company that you shut off their accounts. Like it's process-oriented things. And they go, we audited a whole bunch of companies, and believe it or not, nobody's doing these 5 simple things. So I don't think it's these huge solutions that we need. It really is these simple things and going back to the basics of what it means to be a high-performing organization.
Great. Any other go around last time for one or two more questions very quickly?
I see James has his hand raised, so let's
James,
try that out. Yeah.
James, can you speak?
Hey, that's pretty cool. That's the first time I've been able to do that. So that was worth it right there. So it's just a great presentation. And I was able to download your HBR article and read through that. It's a great read as well. And I really appreciate the approach you're taking to researching all the testing that's being done on this phishing thing. And I think it's spot on. But what has really, the light bulb that's gone off for me, and I want to get your reaction to it during this presentation, is I think there's a real ethics problem here that as an employee, I can expect to be provided a safe work environment.
Right.
Safe work environment. And yet, as an employee, I'm not allowed to expect that my IT environment is safe. In fact, I'm held responsible for it, that this malicious code was delivered to me, and I'm expected to be smart enough not to click on it. Now, I might be way off on that, but so I'm kind of wondering what your view is on that piece.
Yeah, great question, James. And I can tell you it's the most common question I get for this stuff. When people say, hey, we shouldn't even be doing phishing simulation. We should create this psychological safety, as PhDs would say, so we could be in a safe environment in order to operate and do our work. And I agree with you completely. But I will say, here's where the tools help us. And this is why policy and procedures matter so much. So when you're doing these simulations, you should be testing things that are outside what the organizational policy. So if you say, hey, we're not, and I'm going to go back to, hey, we're not going to use Dropbox in our organization because it's not safe, because we haven't vetted it, or we're not going to use Google Sheets because it's something we don't do in this organization because we don't have an IT security presence in there, then I think those are fair game to do phishing simulation tests on. Do things that are outside. The problem I have is when they try and trick you. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to make employees aware of the current policies, right? It's not to trick people. And so I was talking to a senior IT executive in an organization, and this is a company everybody in the world has heard of, and everybody's probably touched their product once or twice. And he said they sent out a phishing simulation that was a PDF that was supposedly from our boss that said, hey, can you take a look at this and provide me feedback? And he goes, oh, yeah, of course I clicked on that. Why wouldn't I click on that? And I go, those are the things that we need to get away from, right? That if they're trying to do their job, now, if you're trying to go outside the bounds to do their job, I think that's fair game. But if they're just trying to get you to click on the phishing email so you have to go to attend training, you're actually creating more harm in your organization. We found things like job satisfaction goes down, job security on how they think of go down for those organizations who don't do it the right way. So that would be my comeback, James, for that.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks for being here today. You know, you can always count on NVTC and the speakers to get you thinking, and that's what you did this afternoon. So thanks very much.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Dr. Wright, thank you so much. Ryan, we really appreciate your being part of this. You've done some great work putting into focus so much good past research, putting it in the present with your activities and the teams and the folks that you mentioned, the different organizations. We look forward to staying in touch with you, and we'll read your material gladly as you bring it forward. And it looks like we're getting some good thank yous from people all across the call here. So again, thank you so much. And we look forward to staying in touch with you.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe. And I invite anybody on the call to reach out. If something grabbed them and they want some more information, I'm happy to share with whatever you folks need. You're doing good work.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.